Welcome to the second episode of Easter for Sceptics, and this time we're coming a little closer to the crucifixion of Jesus as we look at his trial. And as we read the four accounts of the trial of Jesus in the four Gospels, we need to be asking ourselves this question: is this a work of purely courtroom drama written by a fiction writer, or does it have the ring of historical truth? Is this just another routine crucifixion, and there were many of them in the days of the Romans, or does this one stand out as different? Now, if this trial was a fictional courtroom drama, you would expect the prosecution to have done their work and to put together a really compelling case. But the reality of the matter is, this trial was a laughable farce. Let me explain. The chief priests and the Jewish leaders met together a few days before Jesus was crucified, probably on the Sunday or the Monday before, and they made their plan. They were determined that they must arrest him and convict him, and so they set about putting things together. And then something happened that they just could never have dreamed of, and it was an opportunity that fell into their laps. Judas Iscariot, who was one of Jesus' disciples, came to them and said, "Look, for some money, if you pay me, I will deliver Jesus into your hands. I will betray him to you and show you where to find him and quietly arrest him." And so the Jewish leaders go away rubbing their hands. This is all going terribly well. And I imagine, therefore, that they set about preparing a solid case. I think it's reasonable to suppose that they went at that point to speak to the Roman governor. The Roman governor's name was Pontius Pilate, and they knew that as the Jewish leaders, they didn't have the authority to crucify someone. They didn't have the authority to perform any executions of any method, and therefore they needed that power to be carried out by the Romans. They would need the Roman governor to be on side. They also took the time to prep up their witnesses, or at least we assume they did. They found people who had witnessed Jesus doing different things, and they prepared their testimony to make sure that they had a solid case against him. And then on the Thursday evening, when Judas knew what Jesus was going to do during the feast of the Passover, he knew that Jesus was going to go out to the Garden of Gethsemane in the valley east of Jerusalem, and he could be found there easily. Judas left Jesus and the other disciples who were in the upstairs room in Jerusalem. They were celebrating the Last Supper. He slipped out and he made his way through the streets to the chief priest's residence and told them everything about where they would find Jesus. Now, at that point, you would expect all this wonderful Passover plot just to swing into action, but it doesn't. Jesus stays in the upper room with his disciples. He teaches them. John records 3 chapters of what he taught them, and then an extra chapter containing a great long prayer of Jesus before he leads his disciples out across the Kidron Valley east of Jerusalem to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there Jesus agonizes in prayer for 2 to 3 hours. What on earth were the chief priests and the soldiers doing all that time? Finally, they turn up with their troop of soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane. There is Jesus. He's been praying earnestly. His disciples have been sleeping. They're all suddenly roused from sleep, and Judas leads them to the one who is Jesus. There's no doubt that they have arrested the right man. And they put Jesus in chains, and they lead him away with his hands bound, and off they go to the high priest's house. And that is where they hold their trial. The Jewish council, or some of them, enough of them, are summoned. It's called the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin meets, and Jesus is put on trial in front of them. Now, it's the middle of the night, so that's probably illegal. But they weren't too worried about that. They needed to get this trial done. They needed to get him executed before they reached the Sabbath on the Saturday. And so they wheel out their witnesses ready to accuse him. And it all starts to fall apart. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. But there was one charge that they managed to make stick against him. And it's an astonishing charge. Matthew records 2 witnesses who said this. This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, if you spoke against the temple in Jerusalem, which is God's Holy of Holies, that was blasphemy. If you said you were going to demolish it, that was even more blasphemy, just to suggest the idea. And therefore they say, we've got him bang to rights. We can convict Jesus of this claim. And the truth is that Jesus did say something very like that. John records it in John chapter 2, verse 19. Jesus said, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now, I think it's pretty obvious to see, isn't it, that Jesus is predicting there his own death and resurrection. He is predicting what they will do to him, but they have taken his words literally and therefore have been able to pin the crime of blasphemy on Jesus. They convict him by his words, but actually, ironically, his words are convicting them of what they are about to do and also telling them of how he will rise again the 3rd day. So his crime was speaking against the temple, but their crime was condemning the innocent Son of God to death. Finally, they asked him this question, just as a throwaway question almost. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. You see, by this stage, there was no point in hiding it any longer. Jesus said, yes, I am the Christ. I am the Messiah that you have been waiting for. And on that basis, they convicted him of blasphemy. But here's the problem. They send him off to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and blasphemy is not a crime that Pilate is going to convict him of. Now, what do we know about Pontius Pilate? We know that he was Roman governor. There are records outside the Bible to confirm that. And they also confirm that he was a very nasty governor. He was the kind of man who was weak and indecisive and who made up for that by being particularly brutal. You can probably think of other people like that, who just sort of lash out in all directions in order to establish their rather otherwise weak authority. Now, the Jewish leaders knew that Pilate would not convict Jesus of blasphemy. That was no business of his. But if they tried to pin on Jesus the crime of insurrection, well, then Pilate would sit up and pay attention. So they changed the charge to one of sedition, that Jesus claimed to be King of the Jews. Pilate goes into the judgment hall in his palace, but the Jews remain outside. They don't want to go into a Gentile's house during the feast because that will make them religiously, ritually unclean. So they stay outside. And Pilate has Jesus arraigned in the courtroom inside, but he keeps sort of moving back and forth from one to the other. And I think that has the ring of an eyewitness account. Maybe John and Matthew and the other gospel writers have found people who were in Pilate's palace who later became Christians and who had witnessed all of this. Or maybe Jesus told them after his resurrection. What is clear is that Pilate did not cooperate. Whatever deal the Jewish leaders had with him broke down. And you wouldn't invent that, would you, if this was a fanciful account, a work of fiction. Pilate tries Jesus, and he says the same thing 3 times. Listen to John 19. Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. Now, as we read all the 4 accounts of the trial of Jesus, one in each gospel, they are different. They record different aspects of the trial. John assumes that his readers have read about the trial in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, so he doesn't bother to include it. He assumes they already know that. And he adds in other details, especially the conversations with Pontius Pilate. But all those 4 accounts come together. They don't contradict each other, they complement each other, and together they present a compelling historical picture of the trial of Jesus. And 2 things become very, very clear. We can be confident that this trial really happened, and it is a historical account, but it's also loaded with irony. Jesus is convicted on the basis of the accusation that he predicted his death and his resurrection. But he did so in terms of the temple being demolished and rebuilt. They misunderstood what he was saying, but there's no doubt that he said it and that his prediction will come true. There's also no doubt that the man who is being tried here is absolutely innocent. And those two facts are crucial to understanding what comes next. In our next episode, we're going to come to the cross itself and understand what was going on when Jesus was crucified, in all the grim violence of that dark moment in human history. That is what we'll turn to in our next episode. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.